Welcome everyone to another episode of Pats Uncovered. I'm Akanta Malik, and you've probably heard and seen on the many photos of the covers and stuff. And I'm joined today by Jason VANTOMME. I'm very, very excited to talk to him today because he was actually recommended as a person that should be on the podcast from last week's guest, which was Shauna. Oh my God, every single time I make this mistake. Shauna Bang, please, oh my God. I absolutely hate when people get people's names wrong because I'm like, no, just make the effort to know it. And yet every time I talk to her, I'm like, I'm so sorry. But anyway, I'm very glad that you're here and welcome.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And you said my last name correctly, which is like a miracle. Nobody ever says it correctly, ever.
I'm so thankful. Immediately as I went to say it too, I was like, no, I didn't check. That's okay. I always check. No, well, I'm glad. We're off to a very great start, bar Shauna. Oh my God, no, it's never gonna come back to me now. I've mixed it up in my head. Anyway, but so yeah, basically we ended up just very randomly getting connected, and because you've got an absolutely wild career journey, which we kind of talked about a little bit just as we were kind of catching up, and I definitely want to dive through it because I think I was saying, I'm like, last week I did a talk where I was like, oh yeah, look at my career, like 2 years, I've done so many things. Nothing. It is literally nothing compared to what, oh my God, I can't even start into how crazy everything you've just gone through. So to start with, I've heard, well, I mean, you've kind of mentioned, but I've also heard that's how Shauna got into it. It was like, so he wanted to be a music performer and now he's a data scientist. I'm like, this is ideal for the whole podcast. This is perfect. So do you want to talk a bit about like how you kind of got into that end of things and why you wanted to be a music performer to start with?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know what my, I hear world famous performers, like they had this moment or, this thing in their life that was so sort of, catalyzing for them. I don't remember the exact sort of moment where I thought about that. We always had music around at home. We had a piano. There was always records playing, the radio was playing. And so that was very present. But so I don't know what the initial motivation was, but I did want to become a musician, and I came to that a little bit late as a teenager. I started to play the flute, which is not an obvious instrument to play necessarily for a kid in a small town in Alberta, Canada, and so I started that quite late. I was 15 or 16 years old, which is very late, and to have the expectation of going to music school with only a couple of years of playing. But I seemed to do well enough, and I got into music school and at McGill, which is, I'm biased, but it's certainly the number one of the top schools in the country for music, and many other things, of course. But I was incredibly fortunate, and I got there. I was surrounded by people who were just radically better than I was as a flute player and as musicians, and that was incredibly uncomfortable and challenging. But at the same time, talk about a great learning opportunity, right? And I think, I don't know if it was sort of those moments, but certainly there's been something that's been consistent in my career, which is feeling uncomfortable is a good thing, and feeling like you're being challenged is an incredibly good thing. One of the greatest things we can get out of the thing we do every day is knowledge and information and sort of having a better understanding of the world and yourself. So, I think it taught me very quickly that there was no way I was going to be a successful musician at the level these people were, my peers. And, this is like other 18, 19, 20-year-olds, right? It's not like these were seasoned pros, but so that was that sort of early journey. But very early on, and I'd always, since I was 12 or 13, I always had computers, and, my first computer was a VIC-20, and I had, the cassette drive, and then the floppy drive, and the whole thing of kids in the 80s. But when I got there, they were really starting to work hard on a music technology program, which are incredibly common these days. But at the time they weren't, and certainly, I think I don't know this for sure, but it may have been one of the first to really sort of anchor the idea of how do we create technically proficient musicians as opposed to creating musically proficient technicians, like the inverse. So you often saw this in engineering schools as opposed to in music faculties, right? So I think it was a big leap for those music faculties. And so I found that little community there, and sort of it joined these two really fascinating things for me together. And boy, it was, it was pretty early days compared to what we have now. But, when I think about, people always say, oh, if you're a musician, a good musician, you must be good at math, or if you're good at math, you're probably good, those sort of categorizations or generalizations. But I think there's some truth in it, in that they're both systems, right? They're languages, effectively, and there's structures and sort of rules of how things get put together and how things work, and so I think there's some natural fluidity to that. So that was that sort of journey, and then the early days of, what does it mean to work with information, is pretty cool. In fact, most, well, I don't know how many people, the age of the people who listen to the podcast, but maybe some of the older folks will remember there was a computer when Steve Jobs left Apple the first time and he started the next computer company. You could buy these Next computers and they were insanely expensive, $15,000-$20,000, something like that. And I remember one of the professors at the school, he was a music theorist. He was doing work on, 12-tone analysis and, compositional analysis. And his methods were so computationally intense at the time that we were looking at how to network together these computers, these Next computers. Imagine, like, this was like, it was just so rudimentary, and it's just amazing that you could even contemplate it. But, we got something working, and two computers were working on this thing. And, I'm sure that they were like, the fans were going crazy trying to do this, but it was really exciting times. So those are the early seeds of it, I think. Yeah.
It's crazy now then to think about where we are with virtual machines and connecting up multiple different clusters and nodes. And it's just,
that's it. Yeah.
And, it's crazy if you're like, yeah.
In fact, I think that particular problem set could be done on your phone, like without even blinking these days, like, or your watch or something, just like whatever.
Everything's right. Everything's connected.
That's right.
At the stage. I think it's just so interesting you mentioned the fact that like you kind of realized really quickly that you wanted to find your own little niche, because you were like, well, I'm never going to be as good as some of these other people are already who've been kind of living and breathing. And I think, I can kind of relate. I remember when I started my degree, which at the first year was just mathematical sciences. And yeah. The people in my course, there's people who've gotten gold medals for getting the highest score in Ireland in maths. And I'm like, I thought I was okay at math. I enjoyed it and I did okay, but like, that, no, I can't. I remember my friend who would just, I think it was like a basic real math or analysis or something like that. And she would just get it. And I'm like, I could spend a whole year trying to understand this and I will never fully just get it. I'm like, I'll have to understand. Yeah. And I was like, I think it just really is important finding that what works for you out of everything. And I'm like, yeah, well, okay, communicating that kind of stuff is great for me. And I've now ended up in consulting, which is basically just translating things other people don't necessarily understand. And I'm like, it's just really interesting to see that kind of a pattern where everyone just finds their little niche.
You're absolutely right. Like, I remember those, I had a similar moment, obviously realizing that sort of the level of giftedness that the people around me had. But I think the other thing I realized was I started to understand how people learn differently and experience differently then. And it really came down to this sort of very specific sort of set of moments, effectively. There were two flute teachers. I think there were 3 or 4 flute teachers, but there were 2 sort of main flute teachers. And one of them was the principal in the Montreal Symphony, still is to this day, just astonishing, one of the best flute players in the world. And the other one was the assistant principal, who was my teacher, and she just retired a few years ago. But what was really fascinating about their styles of teaching were just completely different. And I only know that because obviously I studied with her, but other people studied with the other gentleman, Tim, and the people who studied with him learned in a very different way. it's exactly what you're talking about. It's like they had an intuition about what he was doing, or the way that he taught was through a specific kind of intuition. I think I will show you how to do it, and right. Whereas the style of my teacher was very different. It was a very different approach, and it worked for me. I mean, I was not her best student by any stretch of the imagination, but nonetheless, her method for me worked really well. And so finding those moments, you're absolutely right. It's like, oh, there's something analytical about how she describes this process, which really resonates, right? So it's like, there's something in that. Maybe I should carry that forward. Yeah, that's really fascinating. But boy, feeling out of place there was not out of place, but like out of one's league. It's just like, whoa,
Yeah.
If you don't turn that into a learning moment, it's just going to sink you, right? It's just...
I mean, I think like everyone in the course, like, were at the top of their schools, right? I mean, everyone was so used to consistently being in the top of their grades, and then to come along and I'm like, so not in the top here. But then still finding like that little place where you fit in, and finding those teachers, I think it's just so important. And there's so many stories that you kind of hear where people are like, oh, I dropped out of computer science because it's just not for me. And it might just be the case. It's definitely for that person. It's just they haven't found the right way or the right person for them to connect with.
For sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So we've done the degree in music technology, and you're one of the first people who's kind of really gotten out of it. So like, how was that? Like, you're basically in this whole new playing field. What was the next? Like, as in, did you know what was next? Were you questioning what's happening?
Yeah, I think along with everybody else who graduates from an undergraduate in something that's an obscure field at the time, it's like, I'm going to go to graduate school. so I went to graduate school, and I stayed at McGill. And I to be honest, I had a fantastic mentor and teacher there, and what I really was enabled to do was explore quite broadly. And so my focus in grad school was sort of this weird intersection of human performance, modeling human performance. So it's cognitive science, and also, I guess, what we might have called artificial intelligence at the time. So how do you represent human interaction in a performance context, a music performance context, in a computer model such that the computer can perform with you? And that was really my master's thesis was, can I come up with a way of having the computer pay attention to what the human is playing? And in my particular case, it was a very specific thing. It was about rhythm. It wasn't about pitch, it was about rhythm. So the pattern matching and segmentation. But again, sort of you finish that and you're like, okay, well, that doesn't help very much. It's interesting work. And so where do you go with that? As luck would have it, my thesis advisor had a former doctoral student, computer scientist, who was doing work in Chicago, north of Chicago at Northwestern University, at the Institute for Learning Sciences, which I think had only been around for, I'm trying to remember the dates, maybe 3 or 4 years at that point. I could have that wrong, but it was an institute sort of that sat at the intersection of education and computer science and psychology. And really the goal was to be able to take lessons from artificial intelligence research at the time in cognitive science research and learning sciences, and build it into systems, computer systems, that could be used for training, right? So some of our early clients were the US Army, the Environmental Protection Agency, some companies as well. But really the goal was like, how do you represent human interaction in this case in social senses? And so like in the Army case, you had to present your findings to your superiors and they would challenge you. And these are all artificial characters, right? It was all human video faces like this big on the screen from Laserdisc. So it was a long time ago. But it was really fascinating about it was, an interesting analog. It wasn't human performance in a musical performance sense for me, but it was human performance in an interaction sense. How do you interact with other people? How do you defend your arguments? And so there's really quite rich, complicated tools that are required for this. You know, like how do you build logic statements? Because all of this was like rule-based systems, right? So it was very, very challenging problems. And so, yeah, that was sort of the trajectory into, okay, I can actually like make a salary somewhere with this graduate degree that's not like, you know, at a coffee shop or something. Like it was actually doing the thing that, you know, using the skills. And so what was interesting about that was the simulation work I did in my graduate program, I wrote it all in Lisp, which, you know, like nobody writes Lisp these days. I mean, people like write Clojure, I suppose, but yeah, so it was all in Lisp, which was really amenable to the problem in the way of representing information and knowledge. And when I went to the Institute for Learning Sciences, the systems were all written in Lisp because it was like all of these, you know, AI guys from the 80s and 90s, early 90s. But actually my first job was actually porting it from Lisp to C++. But anyways, yeah, it was good times. And so that was really fun. It was like amazing. And boy, talk about feeling out of my league again, right? This is a knowledge space, you know, you're surrounded by PhD candidates, postdocs, you know, famous researchers, famous computer scientists. It was fantastic. It was amazing. It's great, great.
I can already kind of see the whole theme of feeling good and being uncomfortable and getting used to that feeling. Yeah. It really does make such a difference.
Yes, yes.
So you moved from Alberta. Were you in? Was McGill in Alberta? Sorry, me and.
No, it's okay. I grew up in Western Canada in Alberta, and then McGill is in Quebec. So literally, almost not quite literally on the other side of the province or country, but very close. And then moved down to Chicago. Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. And then, so you're now building all these things and you're having all these great meetings with actual people who are making kind of differences. I think it's just, I remember being on my first client project that I thought was making a big difference. The work I did was, I was like, oh my God, people are actually using this and like it's helping other people. So I mean, it sounds like, especially with like the army, like building out things that they're going to be using, like that sounds like a fabulous project and the experience around it.
Yeah, it really was. You know, there was this flavor of it's innovation. Is it so far down an innovation path that it never gets productionized? In some cases that was true. In some cases that wasn't true. In some cases it was like legit became part of training programs and things like that. That Army project was fascinating because it was a DARPA grant funded project, and you know, we sort of got grouped into it was this initiative. I think it was called, I'm going to get this wrong, but I think it was called Force 21 or something sort of menacing like that. But it was this entire you know, sort of funding of advanced technologies. I think really, you know, the military, this was in the late 90s, was really realizing, you know, the power of the internet, the power of connectedness in the situations that they were working. And so they were really trying to sort of explore the potential of technology in new and meaningful ways, which of course they always have done. But I just happened to land in a project that was a part of that, which was really exciting. So, and it did sort of get us, you know, understanding some of the challenges of building the systems like we were. And so when we went on to the other things that we did do, both there at the Institute and I worked later for the commercial version of the Institute, the commercial sort of entity, it was very similar work.
So you ended up here in Chicago because you'd met someone else. Like, I feel like people kind of,
yeah,
especially now, tend to like still look down a little bit on those kind of connections. Like, oh, you knew someone who did this. Like, you didn't just get there. And I think it's so important to highlight those things. Of it makes such a difference of just talking to other people and seeing what their other experiences are, which was kind of the premise of these kind of places where I'm like, let's just talk to all these people who've had crazy cool careers and see if it inspires someone else to have a wild career.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the gentleman who was working there, he, you know, I met him once I got there, but I certainly never met him, and I don't ever recall even speaking to him on the phone in advance of that. Obviously, there's no video call. I mean, that sort of thing didn't exist. We probably emailed each other once or twice. I send them a resume in ASCII because I don't think you could use attachments back then. But it's just like quite literally, it was, hey, somebody knows somebody who has. You just have to you just have to leverage those moments, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be. Who knows what the path would have been? Like, it was so formative in both my next 2 or 3 roles, but also recently, and we'll get to that, but just like the work I do now feels so connected to that work then, and like on both a sort of personal level, but also a technical level. And some of the challenges, interestingly, some of the challenges are still the same. The technology is different, but the challenges are similar.
So what was next after Chicago? So you worked there for a couple of years.
My wife and I decided to move to Boston. I sort of had in my head, and I did pursue it a little bit, of going back to graduate school. And I talked to a researcher at the Media Lab, about that potential. It didn't end up going anywhere for me, which was fine. But my wife went to architecture school, and she went to architecture school in Boston. And so we moved there. And Boston's a great hub for interesting technology and related fields innovation. So whether it's, especially these days, biotech and finance and so on. So we went, and the first role, I don't even remember if I had a connection to this job that I got in Boston. It was at a company called BBN Systems, Bolt Beranek and Newman. Bolt Beranek and Newman were 3 professors at MIT who were acoustics professors, acousticians. And I think the firm, I'm going to get this wrong, but I think the firm was founded in maybe the early 60s, I want to say. And what was really interesting is they did a lot of, they obviously did a lot of work on concert halls and things like that you would expect acoustics people to do, but they also did a lot of work with the Navy, because things like silencing torpedoes and submarines is an acoustics problem. And so, I got to this campus at this company that had this incredible history, and there's sort of an important fact I'll come to in a minute. But they had a little bit of a campus, and my boss at this time, she's an amazing boss, amazing person, just sort of giving you a lay of the land of the campus. And there's one building over there that has like the tank in it. There's like this giant pool of water that they would submerge things in and do the testing in there. It's fantastic. Anyways, what was really interesting about BBN was they were in that work, and like people can read the history of it, and there's obviously much better history than this. But one of the things they did was they were so intimately involved in driving the development of ARPANET, which of course became the internet. And BBN owned so many Class A IP addresses, or like some range of them. Like I think they sort of, privately owned more than anybody else at one point. But that made them interesting as an internet company, and an internet presence, and an internet sort of development space, company. And so they ended up getting purchased because of all of that asset that they had. But they did focus still a lot on their core business, and that core business to this day still exists. I think it's owned by Raytheon, but it's still focused on these hard problems. And we worked on, I worked on a couple of interesting things there. One was a simulator. It was a virtual reality simulator. I kind of remember the date for this. So it must have been 97, 98, I want to say. So imagine virtual reality in 1997, 1998. It was a joint contract with MIT, a company called iMetrics, and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in Massachusetts. And really the goal was between the four sort of investigators in that grant was they had these underwater vehicles, and they wanted to be able to teach the pilots, because they're tethered to a ship. And the pilots use a camera basically on a TV screen on the ship, and they're controlling it. But there are certain things you can teach them, or that they need to learn, and that are reasonably teachable, at least at the time, in virtual reality. And so you put on this headset and you're basically observing the underwater vehicle, and you can imagine like the particulates, the ocean particulates are like that big, you know, it's like a grain of sand is like an inch by an inch sort of thing. Because the fidelity is just, you know, but it was this custom headset, custom, you know, sort of auditory experience tethered back to this giant Silicon Graphics Onyx machine. Just really amazing work, amazing scientists to work with. Yeah, so it was fascinating. What I always, I happened to, when I first got to this company, Bolt, Brown and Newman, we're on the floor in this one building, and you know, we walked by this one guy's office, and my boss was like, "That's Ray Tomlinson's office." And I'm like, "I don't know who's Ray Tomlinson." So I go look at him. He's the guy who he came up with the @, when we used it at gmail.com, whatever. He's the first person to use the @ because basically they were typing to these one computer. You can read about this. It's so and so at that, right? And it was the way to specify the location. And so when you read about that, or you know, you sort of walk around these storied halls of all these people who had done these things, it was really fascinating. And again, as you know, a 26-year-old or whatever I was at the time, 27-year-old, talk about feeling like if I was so out of my depth, right? It's like, oh my God, what am I doing here, right? Like, how do I learn this stuff? And I think I did okay work there, but boy, did I sure learn a lot. Like, and I think I was there for 2 years. Just incredible experience. It was amazing. And I, many friends who remain sort of lifelong friends from that experience.
I think it really does highlight that. I think this is that saying, isn't it, where it's you are the average of the people you surround yourself with. And it's absolutely crazy how quickly you can learn when you're kind of flung into that. I know nothing. I am super uncomfortable, but hey, at least people know I know nothing and I can ask all the questions. And it's such a good place to be in, like, selfishly from that point of, I'm like, well, I know I'm going to end up coming out of this with a really, really good experience of it. But
you know what, it's interesting, you hear a lot of, I think especially in data science, because I think the field feels like it's just sort of figuring itself out. And, you know, I always say, people are always like, what is a data scientist? I'm like, well, it's such a weird term. And I think it needs to mature, and the space needs to mature in the same way that, you know, if you're hiring, if you go to a video game team and said, hey, I hear you need a software engineer. I'm a software engineer. The first thing they'd say is, what kind? Like, what's your thing? Are you a rendering engineer? Are you a systems engineer? Are you a gameplay engineer? Are you an audio engineer? Are you an art and technologies or tools and technologies? Like, what are you? And I think that's, for me mentally, that's what's happening in data science. It's like, well, what are you? Like, you can't be all of those things to all of those people. And I think what that drives is, if people feel like they can, or they are supposed to be, it drives this, you know, people talk about, you know, this inadequacy, like the imposter syndrome, blah, blah, whatever. But I think if you find those spaces that allow you to really grow in what you want, even if you're uncomfortable there, and if you always feel like you're slightly uncomfortable because you're learning, then that sort of goes away. It's like, oh, actually, I'm becoming the best at that, or I'm striving towards being really accomplished at that, the thing that I have passion about, right? So I think it can be really misleading for people. It's like, well, but I don't know, you know, ethics. I don't know causal inference. I don't know all the machine learning techniques that take 100 years to learn. I don't know visualization. I don't know data engineering. Like, how could you possibly know all of those things with a depth and not feel that way, right? Yeah, it's fascinating.
Actually, I'm so glad you touched on that, because I'm like, yes, constantly, every time someone asks me, like my dad the other day, I remember showing him these visual, like I mocked up a dashboard on Power BI, and I showed it to him, and I was like, oh my God, look at this really cool thing like that I'm working on. And he's like, I can do this in Excel. Like, why are they paying you to do this? And I'm like, excuse me, I'm building a story here. Like, there's a purpose to this. Don't mock it. And then I look at it and I'm like, I get your point, but I'm going to pretend like that's not true. But like it does kind of come down to it is just multiple different building blocks that build up some like this whole data science world, and you just choose the ones that you are good at and you want to stay at.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you can't tell. I mean, I think there's a case for generalists, and in many roles, I think you do need to think like a generalist, but then I think you approach it in a different way, right? You don't say I'm going to be like the world expert in all of these potentially. Like you just can't. Like it's not even possible, right?
It's literally being like, yep, I am medicine. I do all the medicine.
Exactly. Well, that's exactly. It, right? That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we've done so many things already in your life that I'm like, how do I even keep track? But we're in Boston and you've done all these moves, and I kind of like compare this to now a little bit, where moving is awful. It's really, really, really grim. The packing just makes me want to go die a little bit, like every time I think about moving anywhere. But at least moving in this day and age is a little bit easier with the support, the communities that have been built up. Like, what was that like back in the day? Like, I mean, I know you mentioned you built VR systems in '97, and I'm like, I was a year old. It's a whole different world, right? I'm like, okay, yeah, great. Tell me more.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, certainly those kinds of communities existed in a different fashion, I suppose, and I think in many ways people anchored them. I think it was easier to anchor them in your work, like your workplace. The company I went to right after BBN was that commercial venture of the Institute for the Learning Sciences. It was a company called Cognitive Arts, and you know, what I found fascinating, I think at the time, and also reflecting on it, you know, in the years since, the people who, it wasn't just an age thing. You know, there's a certain age where you just have these work experiences, or you know, you're old enough to have some money, but you don't have kids, or you know, you're not worried about your house, or those sorts of things. So that community built there, but I think people were so committed and so passionate about the particular problem that we were solving, or why we were solving it, because we were enabling people. But at the same time, I think there was interesting complexity in the approach. It was sort of a little bit rebel too, because this idea that you could have, in the case of what we were doing, curriculum through experience, right? And not just like hand someone a book and give them a test. There was a certain amount of rebellion in what we were doing, which was, no, actually people learn better when they actually do it, right? And how do we build an experience, a virtual experience? I mean, it was PC based, but it was still a virtual experience for someone to experience that. Like, how do we do that? How do we give them those hard experiences? You see, sometimes people or companies will do this in real world. They have real world, like scenario role play kinds of things, right? Which can be incredibly effective because people sort of feel it. They're like, oh, I have to be the customer, or I have to be the person providing that customer, and the customer is berating me right now, right? But can you do that virtually? Can you elicit those same kinds of responses? Can you provide that kind of energy? And so we had that sort of vibe of like, oh, this is really interesting, pushing the boundaries of what corporate education looks like, work. And I still think of it that way to this day. But I think that's where our community was, to your point. Like, we had a strong community of people sort of pulling in that direction. And we were also a startup, which, you know, it's not all that different than when we think of startups in, you know, the Bay Area or whatever. Like those sort of, you're at work so much, those become your community in many ways. But there wasn't anything like, you know, meetups in the way we define them now. There was, you know, there's some online communities, but it was very thin. Yeah, it's just a very different time, very different time. Super. And so I actually think relying on people, you know, the connections was really important, because how else would you do it, right? Like, how else would you sort of approach that? So I think that was incredibly important. Yeah.
And I think, I mean, I look over my non-existent career in comparison at times, over the last 2 years where I'm like, so I graduated and I was so used to doing like 14-hour days in college, trying to keep up on top of everything. Because at this stage, I'm like, well, I know I'm not going to be coming out of this degree with like the top grades. Like I knew that. So I was doing all the extra things I could to make sure I was still in that sense of like learning everything I could. I'm also kind of trying to figure out what the hell I actually wanted to do, because in the degree I'd figured out I didn't want actuarial science. And I'm like, 14-hour days were just normal. Like I think my body, I swear, for a good year after college was still used to only having 6 hours of sleep. Like I couldn't actually sleep any longer. It just got used to it. And I remember starting at work back then, I was like ready to do the same amount of work. I'm like, well, I don't know any better. Like this is what I'm used to doing, so why would I not? And the first day, like the first week actually, I remember going into work, and because I was still jet lagged, I'd just moved across, so I'd be up super early and I'd be in the office for like 8:20ish every other morning. I'm like, well, I'm not gonna just sit at home, I'll just go in, it's fine. And I'd literally get people at like 4:30 being like, you've been here since like before 9, leave, like go home, like you're done, why are you still here? And I'm like, I don't know what to do if I go home. Like I don't have anyone else to go talk. Like it's not like I have friends here yet. Like this is kind of all I have right now. Please don't make me go home. But like I just didn't know how to spend those extra hours of my life. But now, like 2 years later, oh my God, I value that so much. I have never in the last 2 years worked over 40 hours a week, and it's never been expected from work that I would do that. And I just, oh my God, it makes such a big difference. And it's just those things that you don't even realize that you value. But now looking forward, if I was to ever look for jobs and stuff, I say the culture of the place, that supportiveness and the community parts of people around you willing to answer questions. Like I remember, so at work I've got a colleague whose name's Bernard. He is like lived and breathed SQL and Excel and like has been in the industry for so long. And I remember my first like week and a bit, like he explained, I'd never even heard of SQL before I started, like for context. And he kind of was like, okay, a database stores data, like let's start at that level. And I remember asking like, okay, select star, like is this all, like is this what it does? Like those are the kind of questions I asked, and he would still put 20 minutes aside, like whatever he's doing, and like go through things with me. And that means so much for someone at that level. But yeah, like now that I look for him, like I could never move to a company without having talked to people in that company to see what the culture is like, or what is your work-life balance, or how are the people. And it kind of just comes back to those communities do exist in the work, but without talking, I'm like, I just can't even imagine that anymore. I'm like, a brand name does nothing to me. It means nothing.
Yeah. That's a great point. I think that I think you know pretty quickly, at least in my experience, I've known pretty quickly if you I've always had two rules for myself about jobs. The first one is always, if you're interviewing or talking to the people, that you potentially be working with, if you feel like you can be the dumbest person in the room, that's somewhere you should go. Number one, for me anyways. Number two is, if you feel like you've lost the fire of learning, or the passion, not the passion for learning, but your opportunity isn't providing you satisfying that passion for learning, for me, that's when I start to think, is this the right thing, right? Is it still the right thing? No, it might be, because it might be a great area of sort of what the work is in an area that's really you can be passionate about. But for me, I'm always like, okay, like how long can I sit not learning anything? Like what would that, not that you never learn anything, but you know what I mean. So I think those are really important sort of motivators, and I think you can get that from early conversations in thinking about what are those workplaces like, what are those opportunities like, and sometimes those exist outside, right? Sometimes those exist outside of work, whether they're in communities, or whether they're in like all different kinds of like hacking for social good or social good enterprises, or those sorts of things that we as data scientists, we as engineers, we as AI practitioners or machine learning engineers or whomever can easily contribute to, and so that can be a really great way to satisfy those urges too, those opportunities as well. Yeah. Yeah, we're so lucky to have that kind of thing now, right? Whether they're inside companies or outside companies, right? I mean, it's amazing.
Allows the people, I mean, okay, even if you aren't that comfortable doing that at work, at least you have the opportunity. Like, it's just the fact that there's just opportunities that are existing for everyone to feel comfortable wherever they feel comfortable. And it's just, makes such a big difference, especially from people moving into tech now. I'm like, you've got all the support you can ever ask for these days. Okay, cool. So sure. We're back in Chicago for the commercial part of the.
No, it was actually in Boston. I mean, they had multiple offices at that point. So yeah, they started a Boston office. Yeah.
Okay, so when did that endeavor kind of start coming to an end? And was it the fact that you weren't necessarily learning as much, or weren't finding the place that you were looking to move, or what was the next decision for you?
Yeah, I had an opportunity to go. This is I want to say this was 99-ish, 98, 99-ish. I had an opportunity to go to a startup. It had been around for a few years, but it was definitely a part of that startup scene in Boston that was focusing on an interesting problem set. I had sort of moved into engineering management at that point. Not entirely, but close. And you have to make, you don't have to. Some companies are actually very fluid this way, but at the time I felt like I had to make this decision of, am I going to really knuckle down and become an excellent engineer as a career, or am I going to think about how to, take my interest in working with people and building relationships and building teams in a technology context and focus on that as a manager, which I did. So I had the opportunity to go to this relatively small company. It wasn't that small, 100 and I don't know, I can't remember what we were at that point, 150 maybe. And it was taking natural language processing fundamentals, classical natural language processing, what we these days would call classic natural language processing, and applying it in a business context. This is early search days. Google was just an infant, I think barely out of their dorm room. Inktomi, Alta Vista, these sort of older search engines were still around. Ask Jeeves was around. But it was focused on business text and information. It was an interesting problem set, right? So you have these large, extremely expensive analyst papers, analyst publications, business information from like the Forrester and Gartner and IDCs, or in the Thomson Reuters and those large producers of analysis. And you wanted to be able to search over it so you could find the right reference point. And since they were so expensive, this was actually a high value proposition, right? Like, it was an important problem to solve. So we were working with companies to see how this would integrate and sort of deploy into their space. It was an interesting problem space. Technically, I got to meet customers. This is the first time I really got to spend time with customers in a meaningful way, and which I loved. I absolutely loved it. It was really exciting, yeah, that sort of went on for 2 years at that gig. The company, the .com boom busted. Company was purchased by a holding company, a technology holding company, and then that holding company went bankrupt. And so I actually went to work for a company that was a client of ours at that search company, a company called Symphony. And I loved the work we did there, because it was sort of taking the sort of the best of understanding, best of breed, work around connecting concepts in language to really surface it at a very high level to people who were paying attention to how their brands were being talked about. I mean, the problem space, brand tracking isn't super interesting to me, but the fundamentals are really interesting and the technology was really interesting. And so we did some really cool work. And that company actually went on for quite a while and was bought a few times. And I think it still exists in one form or another at some companies. So anyways, it was a really great experience. Again, got to spend some time with a little bit of time with customers, but more time actually sort of flexing learning my chops as an engineering manager and spread out to operations and quality assurance and things like that. And I would have stayed, except we decided to move back to Canada. We had been in the US for 11 years at that point, and it was time to come back. So it was a very quaint thing. We're like, Bush got elected for the second time, we're coming home, which in hindsight is laughable. It's like, whatever. It's just, such naive, juvenile, sort of view of the world. But at the time, it was like, it felt like the right thing to do. And, it was a whole bunch of other stuff lined up. So it's like, okay, we're going back. And then we came to Vancouver, where we've been for 16 years.
I mean, sounds like great decisions, because I feel like you've been absolutely thriving there, because everything else that happened since, as if everything so far wasn't like wildly interesting. Like you've literally been at the part, like the start, like the fact that you met like the person who created the app. I'm like, just so many different things here that I'm like, oh my god. So you went on then and you started at EA. Is that where that was next?
That's right. Yeah. I gotta say, I applied a bit of a gamble, sort of a lark in some ways. There were some interesting technology companies in Vancouver that were more in alignment with the work I was doing. But I think I was so foreign as why would you hire somebody from Vancouver? And, this is like from Boston. This was 2005. Still no, you're not like, there's no video calls going on or none of like this kind, that's for sure. Anyway, so what was happening at the time in the games industry was really that the start of the transition from the Xbox and the PS2 to the Xbox 360 and the PS3. And so, teams at the time, or companies at the time, had a variety of different approaches, but one of them was basically spin up a team to work on the one platform and have another team on the other platforms, the older platforms, which meant these companies were growing like crazy. And games at the time was actually relatively, there wasn't a lot of hiring from outside of games into games.
Okay. Yeah.
Over the years. And so that's why I was like, I'll send it in, but I don't think anything's going to happen. And I also knew that I'd have to take a bit of a step back in my career in terms of level and things, because I was shifting industries. And that was a bit of a gamble. It's like, well, whatever, if it gets us there and if it's great opportunity. And it was great opportunity. I got to work on, I was at EA for 11 years. I worked on, I think 5 or 6 FIFA titles, was able to lead the development, the development direction for a couple of years of that, which was incredible learning. I loved that experience. It was hard. It was very hard, physically very hard, because it was just quite intense. But I also got to do things like go to Montreal for 2 years and be the COO of the EA Mobile studio there for 2 years, and come back to Vancouver and work on, cross-company data initiatives, which was really exciting. Got to work on, worked very closely with the studios in Asia. Got to visit Tokyo a bunch of times, and Korea, and so those are all fascinating, amazing experiences to learn from. But right near the end of that, I guess it was the 9.5, 10 year, that's a long time for anybody. And you're sort of like, what am I doing? Right. I started to really want to get back to the technology and engineering connection that I had in the spaces I was in. And in, reflecting on those, they were really very much what we might call data science now, right? It's a lot of machine learning. What machine learning was back then. It was a lot of data-driven decision-making and predictive analytics, or sort of predictive direction. It was a lot of systems that, lit up information for people. We'd call that visualization now. And so you sort of see that path of of sort of work, and I sort of was missing it. I really was, and I was feeling I was feeling excellence in execution. I was feeling atrophy in my connectedness to that technology, and that was sort of like, and then seeing where, data science was really encapsulated. This notion of data science was encapsulating a lot of that work. I decided to go back to school and to see both if the problem sets had changed, like the fundamental problems, but also just to skill up on the tools and technology and cover off some gaps in areas where I knew I didn't have as much strength. Turns out a lot of the problems are still the same fundamentally. We're better at them now, but still the same problems. And the technology is way cooler and way more interesting, especially for somebody my age, right? So it was like super cool. And that's when I write about when I moved to Microsoft, where I am today after 4.5 years, which has been fantastic.
Oh God, wow. Wow. Actually, I can't believe you've actually covered everything, to be honest. But I mean, I think it's like, it really does show though, like when you are passionate to learn and you know what you kind of want to be doing, like you will go back to school and you will get through all that kind of stuff, and you're just going to keep pushing those kind of changes. You're like, the whole moving back to Vancouver, like, well, this is where I want to be, and that means sacrificing other bits, like, which is fine, and it'll come back to wherever it needs to end up being, and it'll sort itself out nearly.
Yeah, that's a really great observation. Like it was no question a gamble, right? And if people know anything about like the housing market in Vancouver, even back then, you're just like, oh my God, how are we going to afford to live here? And you sort of, you have to play a little bit of cross your fingers and hope the long game works out. And but as long as you're challenged and can see that potential, right? And I think I really approached my move to Microsoft in a very similar way. I moved into a role that, on its face was lateral at best, but super challenging and interesting. So it was kind of irrelevant in some ways, like, well, I didn't have that many people who were working for me or that I was influenced or whatever. You have to put that aside, and it's like, what is my impact going to be? Like, what am I driving here? And sort of how do I quantify that? And I think that's something I've learned being in the roles that I've been in at Microsoft. And the company does a fantastic job of thinking about this and having people reflect on this in a meaningful way, which was, what's your impact and how are you changing people's ability to do great things in the world? And it's just, the motivation is so strong. And frankly, in a company the size of Microsoft, the opportunities are virtually endless, right? For both, personal growth and development, but just like ability to impact, right? It's fantastic. It's great.
I mean, that resonates in terms of, Shauna mentioned this of, I think she said her dad mentioned this to her, where it's like, do you want to be using cutting edge technology, or do you want to be building it for everyone to be using the cutting edge technology? And it really does come down to what you prioritize as what makes the difference for you at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And yeah, like that's kind of how I ended up in consulting, where I was like, well, I don't particularly want to build things. I just want to see how it'll change other people's views and how we can help other companies at a larger scale help make those changes. So interesting. But then also, like, I mean, listening to all this, like I think at times people start focusing on like, oh, okay, for this job, this is my experience, this is everything else, this is why I'm going to move to the job. And people tend to forget the life. Like, there is a life behind this. It's not just the tech job, and it's not just the tech. And it's so interesting. I mean, like those decisions where, like, moving back to Vancouver, I was like, well, US is not the place we want to be. In Vancouver, I think you mentioned the climate was great. I'm like, hey, Australia is doing pretty well in that sense too. I'm like, it's a great place to be. But those decisions aren't always tech based. And you're like, it's not always the job that comes first. And the support is so important.
That's right. Yeah. Moving back to Canada, I mean, we came back to a much stronger, not stronger, but a much heavier tax burden, because Canadian taxes are much more than the US. The cost of real estate here was more expensive, even than a really hot Boston market was much more expensive here. And so you have to look at that and think, what is that worth? Like, what is that actually worth? And hindsight's 20/20, of course, and 16 years, obviously there's something right about the choice we made if we've been here this long. But yeah, it is. And sometimes I think when it comes to the connection of work or the environment that the industries have, it takes a little bit of patience too. Like the technology industry in Vancouver compared to 2005 is radically different. And you think of the companies who have come out of here, or people who have come out of here and started amazing companies. Stu Butterfield is from Vancouver. He started Picassi, he started Slack, and Slack has a big presence here. Tableau has a presence here. Not that I think they have a connection to Vancouver, but you start to see these Microsoft, Hootsuite, like all these. This industry is starting to really blossom in an incredible way, and yeah, it was a bit of a bet, I think, as a technologist coming into this space, thinking, is this gonna, what's the long-term potential here? Fortunately, it worked out, but also, it doesn't hurt to look out my kitchen window and see the ocean and the mountains and trees, and be able to go to the beach all year long. I mean, it's cold, you have to wear a jacket and whatever, but you're still like on the ocean, right? It's not like frozen or something. So it's pretty fantastic. Yeah.
I like that though. I mean, yeah, I wouldn't give up. And we've got this big garden around the house and stuff. And oh my God, I value that so much, especially the year that we've had, like with Melbourne having been in like an 8-month lockdown. Yeah. Oh my God, it makes such a difference.
What's fascinating is you just reminded me, like the work that the teams that I work with right now, the Dynamics 365 guides and remote assist team, which is a HoloLens set of pair of applications. There are a lot of public stories about the success of people using those in the current context of COVID, and not even necessarily just COVID, but you can imagine sort of like these remote scenarios where people need to be supported in the work they're doing, and yet we don't have the social structures around us in the same way that we did a year ago, and that is incredibly gratifying. Not only just our products, but how our company's products are helping that, and just how technology in general is helping that, which is just incredible. So it's really, really great to be a part of something like that. And that, is that a learning thing in that sort of strict sense of learning? No, but you're doing it. The sort of outcomes of what you're doing are really meaningful and really impactful, right? So that's really cool. And turns out there's lots of learning there. So. We're doing tons of work.
Well, I feel like honestly I could keep going and talking forever at this stage. There was just so many different things that are so intriguing. But I think we might wrap it up there for today. Sure. I am so thankful for you sharing all of the different parts, being vulnerable with the different things of moving and all these decisions that you've made. And I'm sure like there'll be people listening in talking about, like I think you mentioned, was it Link? Is that the language that you were using, or moving to C++?
Yeah, Lisp. Yeah.
Lisp, not Link, sorry, Lisp. I'm like, I've never even heard of that, but I'm sure there'll be people who listen and like, oh yeah, that. I mean, it'll make sense to others. I'm like, it's been really, really great chatting to you. So I'm very thankful for your time today.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful, and it's been an absolute pleasure spending time chatting with you and getting to talk.
No, well, I'm glad Shauna put this through and we ended up having this discussion. So I will leave you go and wrap it all up today. So thank you all for listening. Thanks. I'm so glad that people just joined in for this, and we shall see everyone soon.
Thanks again, Shauna.
So that was Jason VANTOMME and his absolutely amazing career journey, which has led him from being a musician and learning music technology through to the world of research, the beginnings of search analytics, working at EA with FIFA, and all the way to actually going back to school and becoming a data scientist now. And it was a really, really lengthy podcast, and I will be trying to make sure that the next few ones aren't as long as this. But honestly, I don't think there was any way of making this one any shorter, especially with the career Jason has had. I look forward to seeing you all again in 2 weeks' time, where I'll be talking to Kim McIntosh, another Canadian who has now made Sydney her home and is running a tech startup, as well as running a job at a team at Telstra Purple. And in the meantime, feedback is always appreciated, so please send that through, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.